Little man peeping out from behind me. I love the Super Nintendo. This is the first console I had growing up where I didn't have to share it with anyone. It was mine and mine alone. I got it as a Christmas gift. I remember opening it and getting Donkey Kong Country 2, Super Mario World, or no, Donkey Kong Country 1, Super Mario World, and Super Metroid, and losing my mind because a lot of the games that I had growing up were on the arcade that my dad had built for me and my brothers at the time. And because of that, there were a lot of older games that I had access to at the time, but none of them that I could really call my own because I'd have to share with my older brothers who would take turns, or my cousins, or whoever wanted to take the next turn playing Primal Rage or whatever it happened to be at the time. I think that when it comes to trying to list my top 10 favorite games on the Super Nintendo, it's really hard for me, especially because it is my favorite console. There are some that stand out to me at different points in my life for different reasons, and I feel like a lot of the time when it comes to the Super Nintendo, there are games that I'll frequent because it is a comfort console for me. I'll go back to it and play through Mega Man X again, as you guys have seen me do so many times, or like one of the many great RPGs that are on there. But I won't go into too much detail about that. I will just say that this video is definitely going to be super subjective. And a lot of that has to do with where I was at the time, why I was playing the games, or not why, but when and where.
10.
I'd say number 10 for me would have to be Super Castlevania 4. I've always been a fan of horror growing up, and the closest thing I could get to that was through video games, because I was not allowed to watch any horror movies or really do anything horror related until about the age of like 10 or 11, when I finally started like looking into games, looking into horror themed games, things that I could probably potentially get away with playing that weren't like overly horror themed. One of those for me growing up was the Castlevania series. And with Castlevania 4, I mean, there's a lot of videos on why this game is so great. It really is amazing graphics wise as far as the Super Nintendo goes. A lot of people mistake it for a PS1 game, which is honestly surprising to me, but impressive nonetheless. I think that with Super Castlevania 4, you have the addictive gameplay from Castlevania 1, the non-linearity from 2 and 3, so you have decisions on which route that you take. The soundtrack fucking slaps. The game seems like it's actually trying to get you to use your mechanics to your advantage in this game, rather than in the first few Castlevania games. It really seems like the game is working around the mechanics being a disadvantage for the player, with the jumping mechanic where if you get knocked back, you're just free falling, and there's no saying whether or not you're going to land into a pit, or you're going to, I don't know, get comboed again into some Gorgon head. I feel like with this game, it goes without saying that the mechanics feel a lot smoother. It's not necessarily better because of that, but I feel like that's why it stands out for me within the series. But on the Super Nintendo, this was one of those games that I could get away with playing that was actually horror themed, that I recognized and knew and loved. And one thing that I love, of course, is the omnidirectional whip mechanic that you have in the game, and how the level really makes you take advantage of that, whether you're like swinging upside down in an area, how the whole area can change because of the whip and how you use it. I think that there aren't very many games on the Super Nintendo that actually use mechanics like Super Castlevania 4 does, where everything is at your disposal from the very beginning. So I think that's why Castlevania stands at number 10 for me.
9.
So, number 9 for me was actually pretty hard. It was between quite a few games, but at the end of the day, it had to be one that I had played much later on in my life. It really wasn't until like a few years ago at this point when I played Super Mario RPG finally for the first time. There are a lot of games that I was holding off because I was afraid that once I had played all these trademark games for the Super Nintendo that eventually there wouldn't be any more left for me to play, but that's what fan ROMs are for and a lot of other things. I think that Super Mario RPG is one of those games for me that really challenged the idea of what a JRPG could be. At least my perspective of it when I was growing up. I'd always steered away from it because I had this idea that, oh, it's just Nintendo's version of like a turn-based RPG on the Super Nintendo. There is so much character built into this game. The idea that the main character, obviously being Mario, can get full messages across to other things in the world just by gesturing is absolutely hilarious. There are a lot of super iconic songs and boss fights in this game. I think that one of my favorite parts later on in the game, this is spoilers for Super Mario RPG, which is however old at this point, had to be the secret final boss, which is with the battle music from Final Fantasy IV playing. And as someone who grew up playing Final Fantasy IV and VI, that really hit home for me. And this game's lightheartedness, I feel like, was especially important for me at the time, just because when I had played it, I was not at a great point in my life. But I don't know, I owe this game quite a bit, I feel. As many solid RPGs as there are in the Super Nintendo, Super Mario RPG is one of those that stands out for me because of the character that the game actually has, and the mechanics are super fun as a turn-based game, but I feel like that's just bare minimum these days as far as what people actually expect out of an RPG. However, I feel like this game goes above and beyond that.
8.
Again, I don't know if this list is super definitive. I just really like talking about Super Nintendo games. However, Kirby Superstar Ultra, However, Kirby Superstar for the Super Nintendo would probably be the one that I put at number 8. I feel like this is one of the best, like, little brother co-op games ever to come out. There's like Sonic 2, where you can play as Tails and kind of dick around and not really help out whatsoever. But as a youngest brother in a family, I feel like sitting down and playing this game, I was like enamored by all the different characters that you could play as. I think this game boasts 16 different games. Let me see. Okay, so I think there's 15 games total in Kirby Superstar, so there's a lot of variety to be had in this game. You have another version of Kirby's Dream Land that you can play. Some of my absolute favorite memories of this game have to be with Boss Rush, trying that with 2 different players. If you ever have a time where you can sit down and complete the game, that's how you unlock Boss Rush, once you've done everything else in the game and gotten all the collectibles. And trying to beat that with a friend or with a family member is actually so much fun. I haven't been able to repair the save battery on my cartridge for Kirby Superstar, which makes me sad because every time I get to that point I can't save the game and actually keep it, so it's one of the many reasons why I was forced to get an SD2 SNES so I could actually retain that save data and then go back and do Boss Rush whenever I wanted to. But every single portion of this game has something that stands out to me, and I think that's what makes it so special, is it's not like anything feels like it's filler, aside from the mini games, which have their place, right? But then you have each individual campaign that's in there, and they're all a really wholesome good time. It's also just one of my favorite, like, platformers in general. It's got such great music. It's got iconic boss fights. You got a bunch of powers. You can't combine them, unlike the 64 game, but that's okay. We'll forgive it for that. Nintendo, why haven't you brought back that mechanic? It was so good. Please.
7.
You know Super Metroid had to be on this list at some point. Number 7 for me has to be Super Metroid. This game does such a solid job at setting up an atmosphere and an environment, especially for a game on the Super Nintendo. That's why it really stands out for me and why it deserves to be at least in my top 10. The mechanics are really solid, don't get me wrong, especially compared to its predecessors, which are a little more clunky and can steer a lot of people off from actually delving into the series. And I feel like that's where Super Metroid stands out from its predecessors, Metroid 2 and the first Metroid game. People can find it a little frustrating if you're like me and you like to try and complete games to try and find everything, but that's why the internet exists, so we can actually do these things and still retain our sanity. But at this point, the game is old, people are ridiculously good at it, so it's always fun popping into like a streamer, for example, who's really good at Super Metroid, seeing how fast they can get through the game, especially with how high the skill ceiling the mechanics actually have in this game. It's always impressive to me. But the game makes it worth your while in exploring and trying to find these collectibles just because the atmosphere is so solid and it stands out from a lot of other games in the Super Nintendo library because of that for me. I really do feel like because of the atmosphere in Super Metroid, it set up the series in such a big way on this third entry. I think it really made the rest of the series know what kind of atmosphere it was going for because of the foundation that this game put up for the other games, and it really stands out in my opinion because of that. And I think it's a great entry point for anyone who's interested in the Metroid series as well. 6. I really like platformers. I am a little bit surprised, like all the other games that I mentioned before, that Super Mario World isn't higher for me. I will admit that Super Mario World 2 is such an amazing game as well, so it was hard for me to decide between this and the entry in the Super Mario World games. But I do think that this game stands out for me for nostalgic reasons, so I had to pick it over that. Aside from that though, this is probably still my favorite Super Mario game. Well, Mario title just in general, and that's not easy for me to say. A lot of great Mario games. The cape upgrade is so solid to use, the fire flower is really solid to use. Everything feels so pristine in this game, and it really set a foundation for me in what my expectations were in a side-scrolling platformer. I think as an entry for when the Super Nintendo came out, I believe this was a release title for the console, it really still stands out within the library as a platformer because there are a lot of other titles that try to do the same thing to make a precision platformer or just any kind of platformer on the Super Nintendo in general and kind of fall flat compared to how tight the mechanics feel in this game. I've always been super into trying to find all the possible secrets you can in a game, seeing everything a game can possibly give to a player within one playthrough. I think that's part of what fascinated me at such a young age as far as completing games. And one of my first memories of this game was I had the GBA port, and I remember being really frustrated because no matter how many exits I found, it was always at 96. And I remember going up to one of my friends who had already played this game a long while back, and this was probably in middle school or high school, I would say, early high school. And he was a little bit older than I was, and he would just laugh at me every time, and he wouldn't explain why he found it so funny that I was so frustrated that the game was stuck at 96 and I couldn't ever get it to 100. That's because there's only 96 exits in the game. So I had 100%ed it a long time ago and still put countless hours into trying to find those 4 paths that just did not exist. But regardless, going back and trying to find those 96 exits again is super fun. And that's a big reason why I chose this over Super Mario World 2 for me, was just because I had played it at such a young age and it really set up a lot of groundworks for what I kind of expect out of pretty much any platformer. No matter which kind of playthrough you're going for, if you're going for 96 exits or you're just trying to get through the game as quick as possible or just see as much as you can in one playthrough and you happen to miss a few exits, whatever. However you get through this game, that credit music will always hit different. It always makes me weirdly emotional. And I don't really know how to explain it. There's a lot of soundtracks on the Super Nintendo that stand out for me and that I listen to pretty constantly, but whenever the credits theme plays for Super Mario World, I feel like I'm entering a new era of my life. And I'm definitely being melodramatic because this is a soundtrack for a Mario game, but I do think that it stands out to me a lot for reasons that I can't necessarily explain, mostly due to nostalgia. So that's number 6 for me.
5,
So I grew up playing side-scrolling beat-em-ups. That was the bread and butter of my childhood. I happened to play in the arcade a lot growing up, so a lot of Taito published beat-em-ups, a lot of Konami published beat-em-ups, etc. I mean, the list goes on and on as far as arcade beat-em-ups. There's so many. I could gush about beat-em-ups for a long time, and I probably will make another video regarding that because they mean a lot to me. And one of the games that has to be one of the foundational beat-em-ups for me on the Super Nintendo is Turtles in Time. Is so iconic for me. It's still so fun to pick up and play. As soon as I realized that there was a console port for this game and that there's another level at the end of the game where you get to fight Shredder, I was like, oh my god, I need a copy of this game. I need this game in my life. And as soon as I got it, I think I sat down and beat it in one day and was like, man, I paid a lot for this game. I'm gonna play it again. And that's what I did. I've played Turtles in Time almost as many times as I have with my favorite game of all time, which is Castle Crashers. This game means a lot to me, and I think this is why it stands out above a lot of the other games that I mentioned before, is because side-scrolling beat-em-ups are probably my favorite genre of games, just in general, and this is my favorite one on the Super Nintendo. I think it's also a really solid co-op game if you have people to play with, and if not, it's still a fucking great time. With the release of Shredder's Revenge, that so much for me nostalgia-wise. I can't express how much I love the soundtrack by Ty Lopes, the composer for Sonic Mania, but I'm getting sidetracked because a lot of that had to do with the impact that this game had on a bunch of people. And there are a lot of really solid Ninja Turtle games aside from Turtles in Time, Shredder's Revenge, even before Turtles in Time came out, and I realized that, but because this stood out to me so much as a side-scrolling beat-em-up, as a cooperative side-scrolling beat-em-up, it really made a big impact on me. Cowabunga motherfucker.
4,
Alright, this game is weird. It'll probably be no surprise that Earthbound is on this list as well, but it's also one of those very unconventional games that challenged what a RPG could be for me. This was my first introduction to the Mother series. I never got a chance to play Mother 3 before having played Earthbound, so I didn't even know it was a part of the series by the time that I had played it. I think the first time I played it was on the Super Nintendo port, and then I finally got a chance to sit down and play the rest of the way through it when it was on the eShop for the Wii U years back now. I think that I had a better experience playing it on the Wii U just because I was a little older at that point and actually could tell what the game was trying to go on about. This game really weirded me out at a young age, and because of that, I absolutely loved it, and I would revisit areas that I had absolutely no reason to and just kind of exist. Whether it was summers, winters on it, Tucson, Threed, Forside, whatever. All of them have so much beautiful character. This game, obviously, when it first came out, did not get very much positive reception because of how strange it was. I don't know how much I can say about Earthbound that hasn't already been said before, but that rings true for a lot of the games that I'm rambling on about. I think the rolling health mechanic is one of the things that stands out to me as far as the combat system compared to other turn-based RPGs. In regards to a lot of the games that have been released in the indie space, because of the inspiration that Earthbound has on them, because of the willingness it had to stand out or be a little bit weird at times, or very weird at times, a lot of the things that different NPCs had to say were so strange or completely obtuse that it caught me off guard, and it gave me a whole nother level of intrigue, whether it was the Mr. Saturns in Saturn Valley speaking in a language pretty close to English, or if you were on your way to literally fight a giant pile of puke. This game has surprises left and right, and I think that it really stands out because of that, and I love it. That being said, with all the weirdness going on in this game, the Earthbound is not afraid to delve into some very heavy topics, and I respect that a lot about this game as well. It doesn't necessarily hit anything super hard on the head, but it definitely has some metaphysical themes going on, as well as themes of hopelessness, themes of friendship, themes of what it's like to have a rich dad who never comes to see you, will call you every once in a while and put infinite amounts of money in your bank account without asking questions as to how you're doing or what you're doing. I think for anyone looking for a very unique experience on the Super Nintendo and has not had the opportunity to play any of the games in the Mother series, should definitely try it out. I think that there are a lot of games that I love that have been inspired by this one, in the Indiescape in particular, as I mentioned before, such as Off, such as Amori, Lisa, even... I think that so many of these games stand out because they aren't afraid to be a little bit weird, or maybe be even a little bit similar stylistically, but have more mature themes going on. I think that the impact this game had is real, and why it still stands out to me on the Super Nintendo in the first place. There are a lot of games that I love that have been inspired by this game. This game is like your weird uncle who shows up to family parties sometimes, says the most out-of-pocket shit, and then just leaves and has you thinking about it for months on end. This is one of those games that will leave you thinking about what did I just experience, without like actually being able to explain itself. It's wonderful, and I love it, and I would highly recommend it.
3.
Alright. I really love the Donkey Kong Country games. I think that every single one is really good for different reasons. It was super hard for me to choose a favorite. At the end of the day, I have to go with Donkey Kong Country 2. I love the pirate aesthetic. I love how good it feels to complete this game. It's never like, oh, I have to go and do this. It's like, oh, I get to go and do this level again and try and find this so that I can access the secret world and try these harder levels. It's such a good time. Donkey Kong Country 1 and 3 are also amazing games. I can't really put into words why 2 stands out for me, aside from maybe that my favorite character in Donkey Kong Country 1 to play was Diddy Kong. And then you have a character that's just as fun to play, if not way better than Diddy Kong, and that's Dixie Kong. So when I heard about that, I was like, absolutely, sign me up, please. I want to play this game. And as soon as I sat down and was able to play it, I think I got through most of the game in one sitting. You obviously can't talk about any of the Donkey Kong Country games, at least not the first 3, without talking about David Wise and how much of a legendary composer he is. Speaking of soundtracks that make me feel things, Donkey Kong Country 2's soundtrack is absolutely wonderful, and there are songs from Donkey Kong Country 1 and 3 that are equally as incredible. But I cannot get enough of the first 3 games' soundtracks. It's really amazing what David Wise was able to do on a console like this. In Donkey Kong Country 1, it's really fun getting all the secrets and collectibles, don't get me wrong. And trying to get that 101% always feels good. However, I don't remember there being any completion bonuses aside from the check mark or the exclamation point by every level, and then on the save file it says 101. There is that in Donkey Kong Country 2. But also I feel like there's more incentive. And this is one of those games that also stands out to me for that reason, as someone who likes to complete games, is there incentive to do so, right? So in 2, obviously there is, because of the secret world and because of the different ending that you can get for 102%. And I think that is a big reason why the game stands out for me compared to its predecessor. And as far as the 3rd game, I think that overall I just enjoy playing the characters a little bit more than Kiddy Kong. But that's purely subjective, and I don't know, I really need to give the 3rd game another visit. On top of that, I think another reason why I would put Donkey Kong Country 2 so highly is because of what I mentioned before, is I really like platformers, and because this game feels so good to play, like its predecessor and like Donkey Kong Country 3, it also stands out to me for that reason, just because with the ground roots of what a great platformer is, this game meets those expectations and then goes beyond with the mechanics that are added with Dixie and Diddy. Funky is the main one.
2.
Mega Man X. So it might surprise me to see that this is only number 2 on my list and not the first game. Needless to say, I really love the Mega Man series. I think very highly of the first 3 Mega Man X games in particular, the trilogy. It has an iconic intro stage as far as teaching players new mechanics that they're taking advantage of. You've got upgrades that completely change the way that you approach every level in the game. So I think that sort of creativity as far as level design isn't something that's explored in a lot of Mega Man games in particular, but also just platformers in general, and when a game does that really well, it stands out. That's why it stands out to me a lot as far as other Mega Man games in particular, is because of the amount of player choice there is there. One thing that makes Mega Man X stand out for me over X2 and X3 is actually the way that they have the boss refights in the last 4 stages of the game. So the way that Mega Man games typically work is you have the, 6 main bosses in the first game, but every entry after that you have the 8 main bosses, and then you have 4 stages after that, if not more. And typically around the second to last stage, or on the last stage before the final boss, which is either, Sigma or Wily, or whoever the main antagonist is, depending on which entry in the series you happen to be playing. You typically fight all 8 of them at once. All the 8 bosses that you fought before in order to fight the final boss. And those are the refights. Which is a really cool mechanic, and I don't mind it. However, the way that Mega Man X1 changed it up is really interesting to me, because you get to fight each of those 8 bosses, but it's intertwined within the last 4 stages of the game. So you're not fighting all of them at once. And I think that really makes this game in particular stand out to me from other Mega Man games. And I'm not saying it's the only one to do that, because there are still a few, very few Mega Man games that I have yet to play, and there's a shit ton of them. So that, I don't know if that's saying much, but I thought that was really neat. Growing up, I had always been a fan of the Mega Man series in general, and a big reason why this game in particular stood out to me was obviously the dash that you get eventually. There is the slide that you get in Mega Man 3, and that you keep until, really up until Mega Man 9 in the classic series. But regardless, there are unique mechanics that are introduced within Mega Man X that are a main staple throughout the rest of the X series. And I think a lot of that has to do with the very first game, where it wasn't afraid to introduce these new mechanics to change up movement, and that's why it feels so good to play. Some of my favorite things in video games just in general are music and boss fights. A lot of the games that I've mentioned before this have incredible music and really good boss fights. Mega Man X stood out to me at an early age because of this. As far as boss fights go, the amount of player choice there is, whether you want to use their weakness, if you want to use just second charge buster, so the green shot, or if you want to try out the blue shot, or eventually the pink shot, you have that freedom to do so. And if not, then you can just use lemons, and that's cool too. But I think that's why this game stands out to me over a lot of other ones on the Super Nintendo, is because there's so much player choice to be had. Even just within the Mega Man series up until this point, you have the option to do bosses in a certain order, of course, but it actually has a direct effect on the level that you play next in this game. So, for example, if you beat Chill Penguin, then it's going to change up Play Mammoth stage and freeze it over. Or if you beat Octo before you fight Chameleon, then it's going to flood a portion of Chameleon stage. And things like that are really cool to me. And part of why this game stands out to me, even still, just as a Mega Man game, and also just a a platformer in general. I think it's really interesting the way that Mega Man X was willing to change things up from its predecessors, and how well it's done as a series because of this game. I fucking love Mega Man X.
1.
I know a lot of the choices that I've been making as far as the top 10 list are pretty stereotypical, but for me, Chrono Trigger is, and probably always will be, my favorite Super Nintendo game. This is an example of another one of those games that really challenged what I thought a JRPG could be, what an RPG could be, how storytelling could be done in a video game. It challenged a lot of things, and it also did those things exceptionally well. While the ATB or weight meter in, let's say, Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy VI, for example, were really cool and put a lot of pressure on the player as far as needing to keep track of what was going on during turns, during combat. I think it adds another level of interaction for the player to have in combat that doesn't get prioritized a lot in RPGs, especially turn-based ones. And I think that this was one of the first games that I played as a kid, not saying that there aren't any others, where it's that hybrid of turn-based and real-time. And that's part of why the combat was so interesting to me at the time when I first picked it up. It's very hard for me to express the reasons why I like this game so much, because a lot of it is so subjective and mostly just feeling. This is another one of those games where I played it at a point in my life where I really didn't know what to do. And sorry if this gets a little too personal, but this is just where I was when I was playing this game. Is I didn't know if I would be able to handle the level of anxiety that I had just during my life at the time for a long period of time, and I was not in a good headspace. And one of those things that could actually take me out of being anxious was video games. This is one of those games that everyone recommends when they think of the Super Nintendo, when a lot of people are like, oh, what's a good starting RPG for the Super Nintendo? Chrono Trigger. What's a great game that has to do with time travel? Oh, Chrono Trigger. I think this game does all those things exceptionally well, which is why it gets talked about a lot as far as those things go. There are so many iconic characters. The amount of different playthroughs you can have, especially on a first playthrough of this game, if you don't know how the game works and you end up beating the boss early, you might get a different ending than anyone else. Now that it's the age of the internet, obviously you're probably just going to end up looking up how to get all the different endings in the game, and that's totally fine. I think the game still stands out even when you're trying to do something like that. I think it still stands out in the age of the internet when you can look up these things, and I think that is what makes this game stand out to me, is because it really does stand the test of time, no pun intended. When you're talking about things like having multiple playthroughs, when you're talking about things like multiple endings, different character paths, different witnessable character arcs, those things can be overwhelming, especially in an RPG that's considered to be long form. Like, one of the more recent examples I can think of is like one of the Persona games. If you're trying to 100% a Persona game, you're probably going to be overwhelmed, even if you are looking at everything that you're supposed to be doing step by step. And by that point, for me, it feels like you're playing in somebody else's shoes who's already played the game before. Whereas in this game, even if you do end up looking up all the different paths in this game, there's something unique and worth experiencing within every single one. And the fact that you can get all the alternate endings after your first playthrough in this game and witness the different changes that you can have if, let's say, one character doesn't survive, or if you choose to fight the final boss later, or rather than crashing a ship into Lavos, you choose to encounter him in a different way. Things like that make drastic changes. I will say there aren't very many pieces of media that do time travel well, and when they do, they absolutely stand out. Whether that's movies, video games, books, etc. And this is one of those games very early on that actually, in my opinion, did time travel really, really well as far as a video game goes and how limited that medium actually is without being too confusing for the player. Once you're granted freedom to choose whichever timeline you want in this game, it really is super cool to see how doing something in the past can affect something so much later on and things like that. And it gives this game a level of replayability that isn't necessarily present in a lot of different games. How can a video game make you really like a character that doesn't have any feeling at all? How can a game make you actually love a robot so much and feel bad when it gets beaten up by his friends and you have to take his disheveled body and repair him? It's really incredible. The three-party system in Chrono Trigger is also something worth mentioning. I think that a lot of different turn-based RPGs, especially during this time when they came out, it was the 4-player party system where you would have each one of them a different class. And that still holds true in Chrono Trigger. However, the amount of variety just having one other party member can bring into combat is really amazing, with all the different attacks that you can utilize with more than one party member, or all the different kinds of combinations you can do with each party member in the game. It really also does add a level of replayability that I respect a lot. I mean, it's got references to Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. You got Ozzy in this game. But no, real talk, a lot of the character designs, thanks to Akira Toriyama, are super iconic visually. And then thanks to the storyboard, a lot of them are super iconic from a story standpoint. How they actually revolve around plot points within Chrono Trigger. And the fact that each party member does stand out and isn't just like, oh, this is the mage, I guess. That's cool. Each one of them really does have an impact on what's going on in the story, and you can feel that because of the time mechanic. And it's not like a gimmick that they tied onto it. It really feels like it's something that they had in mind in the first place, and then they designed the characters and story around how it would affect the timelines going forward. Regardless, I could talk about pretty much any one of these games for way too long, so I'm gonna see if I can actually make a video out of this. I might try and make more vlog-esque videos, depending. There are a lot of honorable mentions for sure, and I wish I could get to, well, every Super Nintendo game that I love, and I might be able to have the opportunity to talk about more of them in a video structure kind of like this. However, I think that there's a time and place for each one. I just want to list some of my favorites. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I really appreciate you watching my ramblings. I'm sure none of these listings really come as a surprise to someone who likes the Super Nintendo, or if you're familiar with the Super Nintendo library to any extent, you've probably heard of a lot of these games, and I think it's for good reason. But thanks again for watching.
I can't take much more of you, Captain Pigeon Poop.
Shit, is that a chicken?